Next up, we have Matthias, a well-known iOS researcher, and he's going to be talking about a new way to hunt spyware on Mac iOS. So round of applause for Matthias. Really excited for this talk.
All right, can you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Matthias. I'm going to speak today about Placeboed apples, or a new way to hunt spyware on iOS. Actually, the good thing is, because I'm starting 10 minutes early, I have a little bit more time, even if Patrick doesn't like that. Good. Let's start. I'm co-founder and VP of research at a company called Verify. Our company develops endpoint detection software for iOS and Android, and we specialize pretty much in trying to solve the hard problems on mobile, such as detecting commercial spyware or any other sort of advanced exploitation. In my free time, I obviously also like to play around with this, but I also play basketball and board games. Now, what is the job of an iOS threat hunter? Or how I would like to call this today, what is the job of an iOS threat hunter? So let's start by, when I'm trying to usually explain it, with a huge haystack. Now, this haystack might have some problem, and then you're going to someone that is doing my job, that is going to look at the haystack, and maybe they're able to discover a needle. Now, for finding this needle, every threat hunter needs to know something like IOCs, or in our case, this is our threat. So these IOCs could be files written to disk, processes running there, log entries, so on and so forth. But not every time we're able to determine if the device is actually compromised or not. This is just going to be depending on the strength of our knowledge. So sometimes it's also a could be, could not be. It's not necessarily determinable. Now, when we're looking at recent years and recent reports about how spyware is operating on iOS, we had great reports in 2021. Both Amnesty, Citizen Lab published a lot of IOCs and interesting behavior for Predator, for Pegasus, and we got lots of interesting stuff from there. 2022, the same thing, new IOCs, new interesting behavior, but in 2023, the industry changed a little bit. Now, organizations such as Citizen Lab and Amnesty are trying to preserve their IOCs a lot more because they have seen threat actors changing, adapting to this, and they still want to be able to maintain detection capabilities. 2024 was actually pretty bad because we did not get any really new interesting reports, no new IOCs, no new behavior. And in 2025, we got one, but still no interesting IOCs on the forensic piece. And this pretty much leaves us with the question for any new organization, government, potentially targeted person is, how do I actually start getting into this field? How can I find interesting databases, files, plays? How do I learn anything about iOS malware? So, and the solution for this is, instead of looking at a haystack, we want to look at pretty much a stack of needles, and what we want to generate is a factory that allows us to discover this threat. So I'm looking at these needles now, and then I'm able to determine different parts of threats that I can use for finding similar needles in a haystack that might have been compromised. And this is pretty much what you're going to get out of this talk. I'm going to give you an overview about how iOS malware behaved in the last couple of years. We're going to look at a couple of fresh samples from this year. Then we're going to talk about simulating malware on iOS and how we can use this to find interesting places and evaluate our detections. And then if time allows, and I think we're pretty good on that, we're going to have a demo. Now, why do we want to simulate iOS malware, just not for finding new IOCs, but there is a couple of other reasons. One is we want to understand how the spyware operates on the device, how they're able to overcome security boundaries, how they're able to roam across the system, and learning something from this. And the third part, and this is particularly important for a company like mine, is we want to have quality checks for our detections. So if I'm claiming I'm able to detect a crash log on the phone, a privilege escalation on the device, I personally want to have a test case for that, so to be able to actually show this and see that our detections are still working. Or in a case from a customer, I want to prove that we're able to do what we say, because I also know that telling people that we're able to detect commercial spyware on iOS is usually a stretch. So I'm running these simulations also to help customers evaluate our products. Now, let's study malware behavior. And obviously, the most important things for this is actually having samples. And this is probably the largest difficulty that we have on iOS. Luckily, in the last year, there were some organizations and some very nice persons that donated 1 or 2 samples to us, so we could take a look at some of the more interesting specimens that haven't been talked about in public. And we did release like a report on Predator 2023 earlier this year at DualCon Goa. And we did also public talks on NoClip, which is another specimen I'm going to mention today. My colleague Kevin did this at a couple of conferences like LabsCon earlier this year. In case you want to donate a sample because however you got access to it, please feel free to reach out to me via email. You can talk to me on Signal or Discord or Twitter. I'm also not going to mention your name, no worries about this, but I'm very happy to take a look at these samples, analyze them, and if you want to even release public documentation. Good. Let's take a look at how an iOS malware sample or attack normally works. You have an infiltration stage. So a threat actor is going to attack a process in a 0-click, 1-click attack surface. Once they get code execution there, they move over to a sandbox escape if needed, a privilege escalation stage, and then they're running most often an implant on the phone, doing some nesting things, exfiltrating all the data, cleaning up after them, and then they're going to exit the device. In recent case, or like in older cases, we also had persistency modules, but this is normally not a thing anymore in any modern iOS spyware. Now, during these phases, there is a couple of potential traces or threats that a threat actor could be leaving behind. So let's say we're attacking iMessage, and it could be that we need to crash the iMessage or like some of the iMessage related processes a couple of times in order to bypass some of the mitigations. So we could have crashes, we could have logs from the process, we could have files that are written to disk, and we could also have some sort of network communication if we have one-click chains. Now, then we're moving over to the code execution stage where we could have the implant process running, we could have crashes or kernel panics. If some of the kernel exploit fails, we have log messages, and some threat actors really like to tell the world that they just made it to the device, that they defeated Apple, and now they're running on the system. And then we obviously also have networks and files. Now, looking at some of the older examples and trying to match the different sources to this framework, we'll start with Pegasus in 2021. I'm not going to go to all the details here. I've talked about that a couple of years ago already. So in that case, we had iMessage as the infiltration vector. We potentially had a crash, but we had the files which were written to disk. We had interesting email addresses. We had a call to the second stage loader as a domain. And then once they were running on the device, we had a lot of cleanup behavior already. We had processes running on the phone, network communication, and files. Looking at the cleanup of Predator, in 2021, they were launching from a very famous directory, which is PrivateWaDB, Apple XBC, Roller County Staging. And they were always using process names which were very similar to normal system processes. So RL account D instead of roll account D. They were also doing half deletions of entries in data usage, which became public once Amnesty reported that, and this became one of the best IOC behaviors. They were also stalling shutdowns, and something that we're pretty much disclosing today, which is not necessarily public knowledge before, is that we're also deleting crash logs and iMessages on the device pretty aggressively. Now, in 2022, this moved a little bit, and NSO actually started to learn a little bit from their mistakes. And now they're using real process names instead of fake process names. So they started to use a process name called Apple WebKit Networking, still using the same directory, and this is a IOC that was never published before. And they were starting to delete shutdown log entries. But once again, NSO failed at this, and they were still leaving on the first entry of this particular shutdown log. So you had a completely wiped shutdown log, and then you see the first entry actually starts with a malware sample, which is totally easy to detect once you're looking at this. And they had a helper that spawns from private.temp. Now, on shutdown log itself, this is super useful for Pegasus 2021, 2022, And very likely you're also going to find Predator 2021 detections there, because since 2023, they're actually monitoring for shutdown lock. This keeps a historic data set of every single shutdown on the system until 26, or like iOS 26, because iOS 26 now starts to wipe shutdown log on every single reboot of the device. So once you're updating your phone to 26 and you're doing one reboot, you are going to lose the entire history of all your shutdown log entries, and also the potential capability of detecting old Pegasus and Predator infections in there. So I can only recommend to take one sysdiagnose before you are actually updating the system. I don't know if this is intended behavior or if it's a bug in iOS, but it is definitely very, very bad for detecting these kind of malware. Now, moving to Pegasus in 2023, we now have an infection vector that is actually a combination of HomeKit and iMessage, and this is a sample that we've analyzed. So we do understand this pretty well. So in that case, we had 25 crashes of the HomeD process. Then we had 35 crashes of the messages Placeboed service process. Then there is a privilege escalation stage that I'm not able to analyze because it was encrypted and we couldn't recover the key. And then I'm guessing there is another stage where there is an implant running on the phone and where there is some cleanup afterwards. But in that case, we have very good information on crashes, unified log messages, and files that the sample is leaving behind. Moving to operation triangulation, and this was a lot talked about by Kaspersky, so we're just going to take a quick look on how this looks like. We have pretty much all the data sources that we want to discover, except for potential log messages on the infiltration state. We don't know if any were left behind, and we also don't know if there were any unified log entries during code execution. Interesting here is also that the cleanup stage improved a lot. So we're seeing more crash logs which are deleted. We see more iMessage attachments deleted, more traces from databases. And at the end, they were also spawning as like specific system processes. They only choose backup agent, which is pretty much a poor choice because this process is not used since like the last 13 years. Good. Moving on to Predator. Predator still uses WebKit as an attack, so this specific part, like the chain, looks a little bit different. In that case, we have a WebKit part first, then we have a privilege escalation, moving over to an implant, and then exiting the device. And yeah, like I said, this entire chain was also pretty much covered in my talk a couple months ago, so not going too much into detail here. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting with NoClip. NoClip is a sample that we've also looked at, and we could also see that this was analyzed and talked about by Google Tag in a previous report. This uses WebKit as an infection vector, and you can actually see here that this sample is doing a lot of cleanup, and essentially they're doing cleanup every single time, or this is not easy to see, they're doing cleanup every single time after they did a data exfiltration stage. Funnily, this function is called Pwn Citizen Lab, which is also what it should do. And what this function, I'm getting to this, does afterwards, we're going to look in a second. Now, NoClip used a WebKit exploit to get it onto the device, and they used a WebKit sandbox escape, a privilege escalation, and they were running an implant. Until now, I'm not entirely certain if this runs as a separate process or if they just going to inject code into other processes itself, but there is a like dedicated implant. But there is plenty of like interesting data, logs, and network information and files that we have available here. Good. In terms of cleanup, this is the most aggressive cleanup that I've seen today. So this is so much cleanup that this is even a IOC itself, because they're deleting all crash logs, all unified logs, they're deleting all aggregate files, they're deleting all application identity launch logs. Sometimes the cleanup is all just targeting partial files, sometimes entire databases. But this is very, very aggressive, and as this stage appears after every cleanup stage, you're going to see pretty much these deletions 14, 15 times on that sample run. Now, getting to the last one here, and this is obviously graphite. We have seen this attack happening on iOS 18. I don't know when it was the first introduction, when it first worked, or if they even have now a 26 support. This was disclosed by Citizen Lab. It uses iMessage as an affection vector on iOS, and it used WhatsApp on Android. And in terms of IOCs, we have IPs available, which is interesting because they're not using any like domains particularly. So that also means like every like detection app on a device that will be just like relying on DNS to be a little bit more privacy preserving would completely fail to detect any IP-based connections. So you would need a local VPN in order to detect this, or any sort of advanced like network monitoring on server sites. Now, because the report that we got from Citizen Lab is not really disclosing a lot, we can't really say a lot about the techniques that are discovered here, but we definitely know there is some sort of network communication and there is some sort of small pretzel IOC that is left behind, but I don't know what this actually means until now. Good. Is this all in terms of spyware? Is only Paragon able to like pop iOS in iOS 18? Certainly not. If we're looking at all these CVEs that Apple actually disclosed with exploited in the wild, we see there is a lot of these CVEs that we do not have any sort of like threat actor attribution. So it seems there is a lot more going on. We're just not aware of this. And these are only the CVEs that Apple actually patched. So there is probably a lot more going on in the wild. And also, if you're taking a look at this great report from the Atlantic Council, the Mythical Beast, you're going to see that the entire supply chain of commercial spyware and the companies is actually growing. It's not shrinking, even though Apple is pushing more and more mitigations every year. So there seems to be a lot of researchers and companies that they still believe that they can target iOS and get away with it. Okay, now if we're summing up all of this, and I know it's a little bit messy slide, but what we can essentially see here is all the different data sources that we would want to simulate if we wanted to have some of the like behavior of spyware. Now, that means I'm particularly interested here at crashes because this is a potential source of every single exploit chain. And I'm also interested in the bottom part of the implant behavior, which would be processes, files, network behavior, and we definitely need to have some sort of capability of doing cleanup. Okay. Now, let's talk about how we can actually simulate this. And in terms of my wish list for simulation, this is what I would be want to do for simulating some part of the infiltration stage. It's like repeatedly crashing a process. It's something we could theoretically also do with an extension or with an application, because if I'm renaming my app to HomeD and I'm crashing my app, it's going to look like a HomeD crash, even though the process path inside the crash log is obviously something completely else. I also can create certain unified log entries, not for another process, but that's something that's possible. Sending iMessage attachments is something I need a privileged process for, or a Mac that I could also use, or any sort of desktop. And obviously network communication is something that an app can very well do. In terms of code execution, here it gets actually 10 times more difficult because panic in the kernel needs some sort of vulnerability on the iOS app version my app is targeting. Creating unified log entries for other processes is also requiring privileged process. This is a small mistake on the slide. Placing files in private var temp needs a privileged process. Running processes in privileged paths also needs a privileged process, so on and so forth. Good. There's a couple of additional requirements that we would want to have for like building a simulator. The first and probably most important thing is we want to do as little device-wide changes as possible. Because every device-wide change, like reducing security mitigations, or like remounting file systems or doing other things, is something that other threat apps could potentially be detecting. It could also mess up with our unified log sample, so on and so forth. So we want to make this as little as possible. We obviously also want to have an easy interface, so like potentially an app, and we want to be able to run repeated consistent simulations. So if I'm running my simulation again, the outcome should be very, very similar to the first one, because otherwise these detections or these behavior parts that I could be discovering are not pretty much like worth it if they're changing all the time. Obviously, we want to have allowing for flexible extensions, and we want to support the latest iOS version. Which unfortunately also means we need to have some sort of jailbreak, a privilege escalation as a basis, or Corellium. Because not everyone gets access to Corellium and it runs in the cloud, It is also something that is not really super much applicable in case you want to do some private simulations. So it's all possible to build this with Corellium, but I'm also not very much aware of all the changes they might be doing to the device in order to simulate this. So I'm not going to go down this road. So we're looking at jailbreak or a privilege escalation here. Let's start with Palerain here first. The good things about Palerain is it still supports iOS 18. You can run privileged processes whatever you like. It's easy to install. It brings a shell environment, and you can hook into frameworks, and you have pretty much very nice access. The bad, or like the cons here, is it only runs on an iPad 7. It's going to reduce a lot of these security mitigations, and it has many device-wide changes, and it only runs ARM64E. Another option that we can go for is TrollStore, which doesn't have any device-wide changes. You're able to run privileged helper processes, and it's actually based on a vulnerability that was used by Predator in 2023. So this seems like a very interesting target by itself because it's very, very close to what Malware also used. It also supports ARM64E, and you have pretty much intact security mitigations, which means if you're just like doing stuff in your own application, it is very, very hard for outside processes to figure out what you're doing. Some of the constraints is it's only available on 17.0, and finding devices on 17.0 is super, super hard. And you cannot downgrade, so this is pretty much a hard limitation. And it also works below 16.7, but that means any iPhone 7 is a good choice for iOS 15. And if you're buying some devices like an iPhone X, you might be even be lucky and get it on 16 or an applicable version. For ARM64E, it's a little bit harder. Looking at a little bit of previous work of running these simulations, I did a master thesis 6 years ago on detecting iOS exploits. And for this particular case, I was already building up a simulation, but this time I was working with a public exploit that was handed or like supplied by Ian Beer at the time. He released that. And then I was using Jonathan Levin's Keylin toolkit in order to escalate privileges. This is meant for like building jailbreaks, but I decided I don't want to run a full jailbreak. I pretty much want to stop at a stage that malware would have enough privileges on the device. It supported iOS 11 and 12 later on, thanks to an exploit from Brandon Azet. Yeah, it was super cool for like testing exploits and their behavior. And at this point in time, iOS looked 10 times different. So anyone that would have followed my thesis or even did some little bit of research could have built up pretty much commercial spyware in like 3 weeks. So luckily, iOS changed a lot since then, and it's 10 times or even probably 100 times harder. But the code quality here is terrible, outdated, so this is just a good inspiration. Then Patrick has a very nice talk on making ORED go, where he built a custom backend to actually like simulate the backend API handlers to figure out dynamically how malware was operating. And I do like this approach because this is something that we can also do for a lot of the like malware samples we had here, or for some of the other behavior where we can see what is happening if we would be having a real command and control server and sending data back and forth, how would this operate on a phone? Then there is another cool framework that is called Seashell. This is actually meant at red teaming on iOS. It is using also TrollStore, but there is no commits on this since September 2024. It's Python-based and allows for extensible and remote access. But I had pretty much a lot of troubles to finally get this to be running on like my computer. So I decided this is not something that I could also potentially ship to customers or even use if I'm not able to get this run stably. So we have to build a custom app on our own. But actually this is not super hard because if you're using TrollStore as a basis, you just need to have an app that you're giving the right set of entitlements, and then you can use this app for running some privileged simulations. For anything that would need root access, you need to have a privileged helper process that you can include in your binary and that you need to communicate with. You can do this via XPC or just passing in the right command line arguments. And then I used a reduced entitlement set from the Predator sample, so I did not take in all the keychain access groups and all of that they had, but that's pretty much everything I needed in order to run these simulations. For compiling this or building this, you start with the privileged helper first. Once you have the sample, you include it in your app bundle. You add it to TS root binaries. This is super important because this is telling Trollstore that your privileged helper should also get all the necessary bypasses in order to run the entitlements. You archive it, you export it, you unpack it, then you use LDIT for fake signing with the entitlements that you want. You pack it up back to an IPA or TIPA, and then with TIPA you can easily airdrop it to the device. If you use an IPA, you might want to zip it first, send it to the device, and unzip it. Yeah, and then you can immediately profit. Good. In terms of supported simulations that I've built in this case is I can do files for Pegasus in 2021. I can simulate a process name here. I can do the same for Predator in 2022. And I've built a complete chain for Pegasus 2023 where I'm crashing HomeKit 23 times. Then I'm crashing messages Besto service for 35 times. Then I'm running a stage 2 from that particular directory. And then I'm using that stage 2 process in order to clean up after my crashes afterwards, do a couple of command in control, or like a couple of domain calls, and then I'm just exiting normally. And I also included random simulations, which are super cool for research. So let's say I'm spawning processes with a name process bad A, process mad B, process tad C. These are pretty much random process names that you would never find on a device. So once I'm running these simulations, taking sysdiagnosis and other things, I can just easily grab for those. So, and then I find all the files that contain evidence of this. Obviously, for some databases, packed files, so on and so forth, you need to be a little bit more magic. But for sysdiagnosis, this works really, really well. Then I'm also dropping some files to the temp folder. I'm deleting those files. I'm running network calls. I'm also including the process name and the get parameter, so to test all the different parts. And at the end, I'm also generating a crash with that process name to make sure that the simulation is running. And I can also use that in order to investigate the crash. Now, if you're looking at some of the results here, we can actually see that if I'm just now grabbing for process bad A, that I can see that there is stack files are containing process data, my own crashes here, the analytics file contain evidence of this, all the unified logs here from a sysdiagnose that was taken after the simulation contain evidence of this. And if I'm looking at a sysdiagnose that was taken right at the simulation, I see even way, way, way more files that contain evidence of active processes running on the system. Some of them are no surprise, like spindump or PS, or even power logs that Sarah talked about, but there is also sometimes some files that you're seeing that you would have not found otherwise. In terms of unified logs, we can actually see here a message that is present for every single app that is running on a system. This App Store FastPass is from the Core Trust kernel extension that is evaluating like the App Store signatures. And because this particular bug is using Core Trust, you are going to see evidence of every bug that uses this particular framework, which means this is a very, very good detection method for every Predator 2023 sample because they need to leave these traces here. Obviously, they can clean up afterwards, but I'm not sure if they're really doing this. Now, in terms of a backup, one of the first easy hits I had here is OS Analytics 80 Daily that also contained evidence of this process here executing. Some of the other sources that Amnesty, for example, mentioned, like data usage, I didn't do any simulations on a cellular network yet, so I don't have any traces there. So far, this is the only case, but I also didn't do a lot of more magic to work with different file paths. And now for a simulation for Pegasus 2021. We can actually see here this is shutdown log where the process was stalling the shutdown, and we see the same directory in one of the Pegasus 2021 process names, and you also see my threat simulator that is working there, that is inside of there afterwards. Now, in terms of implemented simulations, I pretty much did most of the things that I wanted to do for infiltration, like we can repeatedly crash arbitrary processes, we can run domain and IP connections if we wanted to, but I didn't implement something for unified log entries or iMessage attachments yet. And in terms of code execution, we can pretty much do all the things except for panicking the kernel. So this is actually good enough to run a lot of the interesting simulations and cases that we have observed by Spyware. Now, let's see a demo. this is working. Yeah, wonderful. So what you can see here is the simulation that is open, and we see on the right side a console screen that contains some of the log messages, and you can see in the log messages downstairs some of the stuff that is my own simulation outputting. Some of the problems that I was having there is that it's hard to debug this because it's running privileged. Now, I'm opening up Filza, which is a file manager, and I'm looking into like the crash report files, and then we see that we have HomeD crashes appearing here, but you can see if you're looking at the path that this is coming from private var temp HomeD. This is a location that I copied my simulated like helper into, so this is not the normal path from HomeD. Now, you see that this is taking some time until all these simulations are actually running and then finishing for HomeD. And at some point in time, we're going to see that messages, blast, or service crashes are going to appearing on the device. I added like a 10-second delay between these two simulations. So let's wait until this is done, and now we can see those crashes appearing. Once again, same process. I copied the helper to the temp directory, and then once it was there, I just opened it up and crashed it. Now, in terms of unified logs, you see a lot more activity like from the MOSIM helper process. This is the privileged helper that is doing a lot of these like calls. This is opened up by command line arguments, so pretty much a very easy and standard Swift binary. It's probably, I think, 600 lines of code. It's not that super complicated to build. Now, once these 35 crashes of messages, blast, or service are actually done, then we're going to see, and you can see a lot of these crashes here appearing here, that there is another 10 seconds delay. Then the second stage is going to be spawning. We can see an evidence of this in unified logs. It probably takes another 5 to 6 seconds until this is done, that this is then coming from the private vardb com apple xpc roller county staging directory. And once this process is spawning, we're going to see that all the crashes will be immediately deleted. So once we're refreshing the filter screen, this is all going to be empty. Now, we see the new process here executing, and once I'm now refreshing on the left side, we actually see all crashes are gone, and we have pretty much a cleanup stage that we wanted to simulate. So now we can definitely use this for detections. Good. Switching a little bit of gears to see how iOS now changed over time in order to do this kind of work. What we can see on the slide here is it's not all, but it's some of the mitigations and detections that Apple added until 2025. And we see they're really, really great at building mitigations, and they also started with some notification parts, but we're not seeing any detection mechanism here, which is just not present. So we don't have any official supported framework in order to run this kind of EDR detections on iOS. If we're looking at the state of malware detection from last year, we have seen that we made a lot of progress on some part of the defensive community where there is more crash log analysis being done. There is a training on malware detection. We are setting more focus on this, but there's definitely a lot more that could be happening on exchange and knowledge transfer. Now looking in 2025, we see there is definitely more happening on this front. I see more governments are picking this up. I see companies picking this up. I see people are getting together talking about this, but there is way, way, way more that we could do, especially given how much funding and money is flowing into the offensive world. There is only a little trickle of this that goes into defensive research. In terms of Apple, nothing actually changed. We still don't have any endpoint security capabilities. We're still waiting for file system or other access to do this kind of work. And companies and individuals also have a lot to pick up. So, which brings me probably to one of the most important questions here is, it would be really great to see that applications for SRDs in 2025 that do malware analysis, and like I said, I have a couple of samples where I need instrumented devices to analyze them, could actually get some recognition here. And obviously the other part here, an endpoint security framework for iOS could probably go at a lot of lengths. Oh, I have time. This is great. Okay, so one more thing. What if we would be taking some of the approaches that I've talked about for the last half an hour And we actually use the simulator to build a sort of endpoint security framework ourselves. So why don't we do what hackers normally do? And if Apple is not giving us an ESF, we start implementing some of this. Yeah, so take a look. So in this case, I have now let me see if this is starting. I have a threat viewer, which uses the simulator and a malware simulator app on the right. And now we're starting the Pegasus simulation. We're going to see that we have Home crashes that are appearing now. And now I'm going to open up my threat viewer application that now has a separate task here on viewing processes. I just built this as a short demo to start up. And what we can see here is that with the right entitlements, we can get an entire process list. This is just built in the app, so the UID is -1 because it's not 501, but this is actually not bad. And now we can just run a couple of very, very simple detections, which are actually super powerful. So anything that executes from private var temp on iOS is immediately malicious. So I just have to do a very quick, simple path check, and I could probably find a lot of malware here. Then similar, we see now our private var temp home D processes spawning up for the crashes. We see the messages blast or service coming up for events, for these process entries list. And if we're looking at events, we also see that this is now executing with a high severity. Now this is going to take some while until this is finished. Let me see if I can speed this up. Okay, we'll just ignore this. Okay, before I get there, we'll just ignore what the rest of the simulation pretty much is doing. It stops at the point where the crash logs are deleted, and then we see that all the crash logs are deleted and the simulation stops. Yeah. But we can use now these specific frameworks or entitlements to simulate how an endpoint security framework could make impact on devices on iOS 17 and below if we would be using it with similar entitlements. Now, this is a slide that I showed you before with all the IOCs and the things that we need to see. Now, if we're moving this now forward and we say we have a basic ESF that just gives us access to crash log directories, I don't need to see the entire file system. I don't need to see user data, but just getting access to crash log detections allows me to flag a lot of the interesting things. Now, in a couple of these other things with some very simple rules like the private var temp directory, private var db com apple xpc role account destaging, with some files that are running from temp or other directories that are not readable, I can build up very, very simple detections with very, very limited detection power. I probably need 3 or 4 file paths on the system that I need a sandbox extension to read in. I need to be able to get a process list, and that is all it would be taking. And if we're looking that everything that is green here is a detection where I could have detected every single malware sample once I hit to disk, we can see that with a simulated endpoint security framework, we could have made an impact on a lot of people's lives over the last 10 years because we could have detected some of these specimens. Obviously, this does not mean that threat actors would have adapted, behaved differently if we would have added this framework in the past, but now looking backwards, we can definitely see that this could have made an impact, and it's probably very likely that this is going to make an impact in the future if we would ever get it. Now, and this is my last slide, there is obviously a balance that Apple needs to strike. And I'm not saying that just for security reason an endpoint security framework is bad and we just ignore all these other points, but obviously any sort of detection capability is going to invite user privacy. Any sort of advanced security mechanisms give us more visibility. Any sort of advanced privacy is obviously going to limit visibility and also limit security with this. But this is definitely something which is not super easy to pan out, and also something that we need to be very much aware of. iOS is a very restricted environment in terms of battery consumption, in terms of processing power, and obviously Apple wants to make sure that all your devices are going to be able to sustain an entire day, and you're not going to have a battery drained just by running an EDR on the system. But I think Apple is a very smart company, and these are problems that smart engineers can solve. So I do hope that we are going to see some of these in the next years. All right, that's it. By the way, I started 10 minutes late, and I still have 10 minutes. So, 10 minutes early and still have 10 minutes. So, anyone has any questions? We have 10 minutes more. All right. I don't see any questions. Then thank you very much, and I think that gives the next one also more time.